So we made it to the month of Adar. It's the 12th month. And for anyone who's been joining these shiurim since the very beginning, first of all, Mazel Tov. We made it through a full calendar cycle together, which is amazing. And each month for the last year, we've kicked things off by looking for inspiration to help guide us in the month ahead. And we tackle each month in its own way because every month is different, as we've seen. So for example, Adar is an especially joyous month. As the Gemara in Tani tells us, Mishenichnas Adar, Marbin B'Simcha. We all know that line. We sing that line. We increase our joyousness. So let's ask, why so much joy in this month? What's so joyous about Adar? Now, the simplest reason is that the main event of the month of Adar is Purim. And Purim, as we know, is a ruckus and joyous holiday. So, of course, it's something that we're excited about. But note that the Gemara doesn't say just Misha Nichnas Purim Marbim B'Simcha. Rather, the whole month of Adar is a particularly joyous time. So maybe it's just that the joy of Purim radiates into the rest of the month. That may well be the reason. But there are probably other reasons as well. So one reason, additionally, again, not the reason, but maybe a reason why Adar is so joyous has to do with the fact that Adar is the last month of the Jewish calendar. It's the 12th month. And we finish the cycle of a Jewish year with maximum simcha, like a siyum, like a graduation, like we celebrate Simchat Torah when we finish the cycle of the Torah. Ends of cycles are exciting, and they should be celebrated. Because by the time that we get to the end of a full cycle of the calendar, we've actually been through a lot. Frankly, the Jewish calendar is an emotional roller coaster. As we've seen, we start out the year in the first few months with some really high highs, from Pesach to Shavuot. That's basically the first quarter of the year. We kick things off with a bang. And then we hit a period of some really low lows in Tammuz, Av. And then we have periods of deep introspection in Elul and Tishrei, at least the first part of Tishrei. And then we have periods of unease and uncertainty. For example, when we start praying for rain in the month of Cheshvan. And then Kislev is the darkest month of the year, but has a festival of light in it. We've talked about each of these in each month. Anyways, it goes on and on. The Jewish year forces us to use all of our emotions and to deal with so many aspects of the Jewish experience and of the human experience, both the good and the bad. Basically, it's an emotional workout. And maybe for that reason, it's even more important that when we get to the end of the cycle, the last month should be characterized by joy. Right? The last month is a time of maximum simcha. So, okay, with that background, tonight we're going to learn a couple of, I think, really amazing sources that will hopefully open our minds as we finish out a full cycle of the Jewish calendar. Okay, so let's dive in with the first of the two sources we're going to go through tonight. Okay, so let me share a screen. Okay, so the first source is a really incredible Gemara from Masechet Shabbat. This is a well-known Gemara, but we're going to go through it in some depth. And let's read it together, and then we'll kind of analyze it. So it says, "V'ityatzvu betachtit hahar," and they stood at the base of the mountain. So this is at the base of Har Sinai. This is Bnei Israel arriving at Har Sinai. And it says that they stood at the base, but kind of literally, tachtit can mean under. So they stood at the base of the mountain is the simple reading, but it could also be read in a more literal way, and they stood under the mountain. So Amar Rav Avdimi Bar Chama Bar Chasa, Melamed, Shekafa HaKadosh Baruch Hu Alehem et Hahar Kegigit. This teaches us that Hashem took the mountain and held it over them as if it was a barrel, basically held it over their heads. V'amar lahem, im atem mekablim haTorah mutav, v'im lav sham tehek v'oratchem. So Hashem said to Bnei Israel, if you accept the Torah, great. But if not, this will be your grave. This will be your burial place. Okay, so that's the first statement. Amar Rav Acha Bar Yaakov. Mikan moda'ara ba leoraita. So Rav Acha Bar Yaakov exclaims after kind of hearing that first way of telling the story of Bnei Israel at Har Sinai. He says, wait a second, if Hashem held the mountain over their heads and basically threatened and compelled them to accept the Torah, isn't this a way of making a claim against the Torah? Meaning, this is taken to mean, isn't this basically a loophole, or isn't this a reason that we could give for why the Torah is not binding on us? Because if it was forced upon us, isn't that a loophole that would allow us to get out of it being binding on us? Okay, so that's an amazing second statement. And then the third statement is, Amarava, Afal Pichen, Hadur Kabluha Bimei Achashverosh. So he says, even so, even though they were forced into accepting the Torah in the way described above, they later accepted the Torah in the days of Achashverosh, Dichtiv, as it says in the Megillah, Kimu v'kiblu haYehudim. The Jews rose up and accepted it. Kimu mashe kiblu kvar. And this is kind of a midrashic way of reading this. They accepted, they got up and accepted what they had already accepted in the past. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing and let's break this down. So again, this is a famous Gemara, but like many famous Gemaras, I always find you kind of have to go back and read them again in detail, and you come away with some new insights. So this Gemara has three statements. Each one is more astonishing than the next. So the first one, that God forced Bnei Israel to accept the Torah against their will, that he held the mountain over their heads and said, this is it. Basically, it's do or die. Okay, so that's the first. The second, that maybe the Torah isn't binding on us today. Maybe there's a loophole that we could use to get out of the obligations of the Torah because we never accepted it freely, if that was the case. And the third statement, that somehow the generation of the Purim story accepted the Torah once again, kind of like renewing your vows, I guess you could say, okay? The Bnei Israel accepted it and in this later generation of Purim, and that acceptance was somehow more effective. So what is the Gemara talking about? I mean, honestly, it's like you can barely understand the first comment and even less the second. And the third one may be the strangest of all. So let's go through each one and think them through. So the first statement, the first amazing statement of Dimi Bar Chasa, who tells us that at Har Sinai, Hashem coerced Bnei Israel into accepting the Torah. Basically, he gave them an offer that they couldn't refuse. So this is clearly not the simple reading of the text, right? This is not the pshat. You may be thinking, what happened to Nasev and Ishmael? The Jews saying in the affirmative, we will hear and we will do. And there are actually three places in the book of Shemot where Bnei Israel affirm that they will accept the laws that Hashem is offering them. The first place is in the 19th chapter in Parsha Yitro. It's actually before the giving of the Ten Commandments at Har Sinai. Okay, before all that, it says, "Vayanu kol ha'am yachdav yomru kol asher diber Hashem na'aseh." It says the whole nation answered together and said, everything that Hashem says, we will do. Even before Hashem says it. Actually, it's interesting. They don't say Nasev and Ishmael in that line, but that is even before they receive the Torah, receive the Ten Commandments, they say Naaseh. Second, afterwards in Parsha Mishpatim, which we recently read, it says there, V'yavo Moshe v'saper la'am et kol divrei Hashem ve'kol hamishpatim. So Moshe comes and he tells them everything that Hashem said, all of the laws. V'ya'an kol ha'am kol echad, and the entire nation said in one voice, V'yamru kol hadvarim asher diber Hashem na'aseh. Again, they're like, we will do it. And then finally, the third time is the line that we're kind of more used to thinking about. It says that basically Moshe took the Sefer Habrit, Vayikra be'oznei ha'am, and he read it to the people. V'yamru, and the people responded, Kol asher diber Hashem na'aseh v'nishma. Okay, so the Torah seems to be going out of its way to convey to us that Bnei Israel actually signed up for the Torah, that they accepted the Torah. And we all know that there are midrashim as well that seem to get across the same message, that the Jews were fully on board when they arrived at Har Sinai. So for example, when the Torah says that Bnei Israel camped at the foot of the mountain, another kind of famous chazal, it says, V'yis'u merifidim, v'yavo'u midbar Sinai, v'yachanu bamidbar. Okay, so they traveled from Refidim and they came to the desert, the wilderness of Sinai. and they camped, they plural, vayachanu bamidbar, and then it says vayichan sham Yisrael neged Adar. And there Bnei Israel encamped before the mountain, but they're in the singular, vayichan. So it switches from the plural to the singular. The Midrash picks up on this oddity of the language, right? Going from plural to singular, talking about Bnei Israel. And Rashi famously brings down the statement of Chazal that the singular is used because Bnei Israel were keish echad belev echad, like one person with one heart. But the message again is they're fully on board. They're like one person. They're fully on board. And then think about the famous Midrash of Hashem bringing the Torah to the various nations, and each of them turns it down once they find out what's inside of it. But Bnei Israel, finally come along and say, Na'aseh v'nishma, count us in. We'll find out later exactly what we signed up for. But again, the seems to be a very strong push, both in the Pshat and in the text of the Torah itself, and also in Midrashim, that is stressing over and over, we chose the Torah just as Hashem chose us. Apparently, Rav Avdimi doesn't buy that. He would say, sure, Bnei Israel said Na'aseh v'nishma, or Na'aseh, depending on which case. Okay, they said we'll do it. But you might say, what choice did they really have? So he phrases it in a certain way. He says Hashem had the mountain hanging over their heads. But you might say it, think of it in a slightly different way, which is that here you have a slave people that had just been freed from bondage, and they'd experienced all of the great things, all the fanfare of the Exodus with its plagues and its wonders, and they'd seen the greatest empire in the world defeated. And after all that, Hashem comes to them after all that he's done for them and says, by the way, I have some expectations for you about what you're going to do in return. And at that point, could Bnei Israel really have said anything but yes? So when you think about it that way, whether because literally they had a mountain hanging over their heads, or kind of figuratively they had, kind of after so much that God had done for them, they had, so to speak, the mountain hanging over their heads. They had no real choice in the matter. They basically had to say yes. Okay, so that's the first amazing statement of the Gemara. In this telling of the story, Bnei Israel were effectively coerced by God into accepting the Torah, with the mountain held above them, with no way to say anything other than yes. And even if not a mountain literally above them, that basically they had no choice in the matter other than to accept the Torah at that time. Okay. Second statement of the Gemara is by Rav Acha bar Yaakov that we saw. He takes the argument a step further. He says, if it's true that God coerced Bnei Israel into accepting the Torah at Har Sinai, if they had no real choice in the matter, then that would be grounds for later generations of Jews to claim that the Torah is actually not binding upon them. And the implication is that real free acceptance of the Torah is required for it to be binding on that generation and binding on future generations. Now you might ask, where does that idea come from? Who says the mitzvot have to be freely accepted for them to be binding? I mean, in some sense, doesn't the whole concept of a mitzvah, the whole concept of commandedness in general, kind of assume that sometimes we have to do things because God says so, whether we consent or not? Don't we sometimes talk about all mitzvot, the yoke, so to speak, the yoke of mitzvot that bind us? That language doesn't sound like it's contingent on our consent. So Acha bar Yaakov seems to be saying, yes, surprisingly, consent matters. Consent is a prerequisite. We have to accept our commandedness, or at the very least, our forefathers needed to have accepted it for it to become binding on future generations. This is not obvious, okay? After all, he might point out that we saw that the Torah repeats over and over that Bnei Israel said Na'aseh or Na'aseh v'nishma. So he might point out the implication seems to be that their consent somehow mattered. And Rav Acha bar Yaakov asks, if our ancestors had no real option other than to accept the Torah at Har Sinai, then wasn't their acceptance deficient? And if so, what binds us to keep the Torah today? And the Gemara seems to think that's a pretty good question. Okay, so that's the second statement. Third amazing statement comes from Rava, who comes to resolve the issues that were raised above. So Rava says as follows. He says, I'll grant you Rav Acha bar Yaakov's point that consent is required for commandedness. Okay, and I'll grant you Rav Avdimi's point that the original giving of the Torah lacked this crucial aspect of consent. But even so, says Rava, the Torah was accepted consensually by our ancestors, just not in the generation of the Exodus. The truly free acceptance of the Torah, which bound our ancestors and continues to bind us today, happened later. So you might ask, when? Okay, so he says, during the generation of Achashverosh, at the time of the Purim story. Now, what does that mean? So Rava points to the words that come from near the end of the Megillah, in the 9th parak, where it says, Kimu vekiblu, they rose up and accepted. So let me read you that actual pasuk, just for context. It says, Kimu vekiblu haYehudim alehem ve'al zar'am ve'al kol hanilvim alehem ve'lo yavor liot osim et shnei hayamim ha'ele kichtavam ve'chizmanam bechol shana ve'shana. Okay, that means that the Jews rose up and accepted upon themselves, on their descendants, and all who might join them, to observe these 2 days, as written in their proper time every year. Okay, so in the pshat of that pasuk, it says the Jews accepted something, but what were they accepting? So in context, in the simple reading, it's talking about the Jews accepting the holiday of Purim, not their accepting of the entirety of the Torah, right? So this line kimu v'kiblu, you might say is kind of like at first it feels like maybe it's a hook in the text, an asmachta, we would say. It doesn't really explain Rava's point exactly that the generation of Purim accepted the Torah in a deeper, more authentic way, or you might say more importantly, a more binding way than earlier generations. Maybe this is just a hint that he's hooking on to, okay? That's one way to think about it. But let's think about it maybe in a slightly different way. Maybe what Rava is saying is this. So as we discussed, the generation of the Exodus that experienced the revelation at Har Sinai couldn't have done anything but accept the Torah. After what they've been through, how could they say anything but yes when God offered them the Torah? And all the more so if there was an actual mountain over their heads. Okay. Not so for the Jews who survived the Purim story. Those Jews found themselves in a very different situation. So the Jews of the Purim story faced annihilation. They were being oppressed by the greatest empire of their day, which at that time was the Persian Empire, much like their forefathers, like our forefathers were oppressed by the greatest empire of their day, the Egyptians. Okay, so in that sense, the two stories are similar. But in the case of Purim, Hashem doesn't come to the rescue of the Jews with plagues and wonders. So it's kind of similar to Pesach in some ways, but very different in another way. Of course, things do work out in the end for the Jews of Persia in a dramatic and amazing turnaround. So there is a miracle to be found in the story if you're looking for it. But the way that you tell the Purim story depends in part on your perspective. So by the skin of their teeth, the Jews managed to survive. And thankfully, they had the great leadership of Mordechai and Esther, who step up at just the right moment. And thankfully, they had the good fortune that King Achashverosh was a bit of a bumbling fool, it seems. And thankfully, the wicked Haman has so much hubris that he basically leads to his own downfall. So all the things that we know from that story. But basically, it was a close call. And certainly quite different than the salvation that the Jews experienced in Egypt. Right? God doesn't show up with frogs or locusts or hail from the sky to save the Jews of Persia. In fact, the Jews of Persia had to fight with their own hands for them to survive. And as we know, the Megillah doesn't include the name of Hashem anywhere in it. So is there any greater proof that you can tell the entire Purim story without referencing Hashem? Okay, the Megillah actually does that. So the implication of the story is that Hashem is working behind the scenes, but you have to be looking for him to find him there, right? That seems to be the way that the story is told. Okay, so what reaction should we have expected from the Jews who survived that near-death experience? So the reaction of that generation could have gone in a variety of directions. They could have said, hey, being a small scattered minority surrounded by great empires isn't a very good deal. Okay, and note that even after the Purim story ends, the problem isn't really resolved. There's always the risk that another Haman can rise up in another generation. The Jews of that day might have asked, my God, when does this persecution ever end? Even after they've been saved. And keep in mind that just a few generations, not so long beforehand, the Babylonians had conquered Jerusalem, destroyed the Beit HaMikdash, exiled the Jews from their land, and the Jews were not saved from that. So the Jews of the Purim story might have wondered whether living as a distinctive minority is worthwhile at all. And by the way, This is, as I'm saying it, you might notice, this is a question that many Jews of the diaspora face today. Wouldn't it be easier to just assimilate and stop fighting to survive as a minority, which is really, really hard? And in the Purim case, we know that a measure of assimilation had already set in among the Jews of Persia, right? This can be seen from the fact that Mordechai and Esther have Persian names, and not just any Persian names, but got names associated with Persian gods. So Mordechai, Mordechai is a Persian name related to the pagan god Marduk, and Esther is a Persian name related to the pagan fertility god Ishtar. So there's something going on where you have the main characters of the story not only have you might think assimilated names, but also, especially with names that even have pagan gods in them. Okay, so again, that leads to this idea that the Jews of that generation had a hard choice to make, kind of where they wanted to, how they wanted to raise their kids, let's say. And also keep in mind, what were the Jews doing in Persia at all at this point? So this was a community that remained in Persia even after Ezra and Nehemiah had already returned to the land of Israel to rebuild the Beit HaMikdash, right? So these are Jews who remained in the diaspora by choice. Not everybody always thinks about this, right? The Persian Jews of the Purim story are part of the community that chose to remain in the diaspora, actually a while after Cyrus the Great, king of Persia, had allowed the Jews to return to their land and rebuild the Beit HaMikdash. Right, so the proclamation of Cyrus the Great that allows the Jews to return and rebuild the Beit HaMikdash in the days of Ezra happened generations before the Purim story would have taken place, meaning Ahasuerus is the fourth king in the line of Cyrus's dynasty. So it's actually a while after Ezra returns. Okay, so prior to Purim, you might have predicted, before the Purim story starts, you might have predicted that the diaspora community of Persia was headed towards fizzling out, that they would be on their way to assimilating and disappearing, the way that the 10 tribes were lost after they were exiled by the Assyrians. So even in our own history, that's kind of the standard. You get exiled, and the people who stay exiled just kind of fizzle out. But instead, the Jews of Persia go in the opposite direction. Okay, when threatened as Jews, they step up. And maybe the experience is what actually wakes them up to the importance of their heritage, who knows? But when the dust settles, they showed that they didn't just see the Purim story as a series of fortunate events. How did they show this? How did they show that, that they took away something, grander from what they'd been through? So they showed it by enacting a holiday that expresses the point that this was all ordained by a higher power. So the Jews of that generation saw the hand of God that had saved them, just as it had saved their forefathers in the Exodus, just without the frogs and without the locust. Okay, this wasn't obvious. It might have been true, but it wasn't obvious. So all of that is the kimu v'kiblu of Purim, right? Not just that they accepted these days of Purim. The pshat was kimu v'kiblu means they accepted these days of Purim as a holiday for themselves and for future generations. But the deeper meaning is that they accepted the whole package of remaining Jewish, even when it was hard, even after having survived a near-death experience. And the fact that their reaction to what had happened to them led them to establish a holiday by which their children and children's children forever would thank God on this day for what he had done, even we're kind of working from the shadows. That's the sign that they were accepting the Torah and Judaism as a whole for themselves and for their children forever. Okay, that you could say that doubling down on Judaism was voluntary, right? God didn't hold a mountain over them, so to speak, right? They could have just gone a different direction. They could have just said, we thank our lucky stars that we made it through alive and moved on. Or even more, they could have kind of thrown in the towel after that experience and said, again, being a small, distinctive people in a bigger world just isn't worth the work. And this question kind of plagues us into the modern day, right? We live in times in which, in many ways, are miraculous, you could say, right? So, in many respects, right? Most importantly, the rise of the state of Israel, and secondarily, the success of the Jewish community, the most successful diaspora community we've probably ever had. So there are these kind of miraculous things that we live through. And similarly, you can choose to see miracles or you could choose not to. So today as well, Jews are asked to choose freely. Do they see miracles or not? Do they see their Judaism as mattering enough to fight for it or not? And the punchline of the Purim story is that the Jewish community of Persia didn't throw in the towel, and that's why we have Purim. And again, just to kind of sum that up, that the spirit with which they accepted their Judaism freely is the spirit by which Judaism continues to this day. And that idea is the sense in which the generation of Ahasuerus accepted the Torah in a kind of more authentic and powerful and binding way, more binding even than the original acceptance at Har Sinai. Okay, so that's the message of the first source that we learn together tonight. The Gemara is basically using Purim as a model for free, consensual acceptance of the Torah. At a time when the Jews could have opted out, when there was no mountain hanging over their heads, the Jews chose to rededicate themselves to their Judaism freely. And the Gemara's implication is that this kind of acceptance, free acceptance of the Torah upon yourself, is what ultimately lasts. Because if you have the law forced upon you against your will, if you have it held over your head, so to speak, you will try to figure out loopholes to get out of it. And we all know people who experience their Judaism in this way, as if it's forced upon them. And the Gemara tells us, if you feel like it's forced upon you, you'll forever be looking for a way out. But if you accept the Torah freely upon yourself, that connection stays with you forever, and it's something that you'll pass on. So I think that's a very beautiful idea to keep in mind on Purim. Okay, source number one. Okay, source number two, I think, takes this idea even further. It's a much later source, but I think builds on the Gemara that we just learned, so you kind of had to have that as background. And this comes from the teachings of none other than Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. Okay, so we're going to read through a piece of his together. We're going to try to tease out the messages that Rabbi Nachman is trying to get across. Warning, Rabbi Nachman of Breslov's writings are difficult. They require a lot of work. So we're going to have to decipher a little bit, but I think there's a payoff. So, okay, let's do that together. I'm going to share screen. Okay, so this is from Likutei Moharan. So it says, Achar Purim Korin Parshat Para. After Purim, we read Parshat Para, one of the four special parshiot. Shehi Hachana LePesach. And we read Parshat Para as a preparation for Pesach. Ki Parshat Para Korin Kadeshu Nisharin Letaher Mitum'at Met. Kadeshu Yuterin Lasot Pesach. He says that the reason why we have Parshat Para as one of the four key parshiot is we have to learn the laws of Para Duma, which was used to purify people who had become ritually impure. And the reason why we're talking about that now is as a prep for Pesach, because you can't give the Korban Pesach if you're impure. So we give you kind of notice that you should study up on the laws and be prepared. Okay. Uvatchila hu bechinat pur. And Purim, in the beginning, is in the sense of pur, right? The lot. Ki Purim al Shem HaPur, because as it says in Megillat Esther, the name of the holiday Purim is after the lottery. Ve'achar kach naaseh, I'm going to skip this parenthetical. Ve'achar kach naaseh para. And this is very typical of Rabbi Nachman. And the pur becomes para. So it's a little bit of a wordplay connection. Ki gam Purim hu bevadai hiluch v'derech lePesach. Pur is related to para. Just as para is the preparation for Pesach, so too Purim is a preparation for Pesach. V'zehu b'chinat siftotav shoshanim notafot mor over. Now he quotes a line from Shir HaShirim, which Shir HaShirim, which we actually read during Chol Moed Pesach. So he says he's going to make a connection from a line in Shir HaShirim between Purim and Pesach. So siftotav, the first word, siftotav, is lips, Ze bechinat Pesach. This is a reference to Pesach. Pesach. This is a speaking mouth, and that's a certain play on word, kind of midrash, on the meaning of the word. Pesach means pass over or hover, however you want to translate it. But in this idea, it's the spoken word. Okay, so Shoshana hi Esther. So Siftotav is a reference to Pesach. Shoshanim, the roses, that is a reference to Esther, as is brought in the Zohar. Okay, it's a reference, rather through the writings of the Arizal. Oh, excuse me, in the Zohar and in the writings of the Arizal. Okay, and also Shoshana in Gematria is Esther. So, okay, amazing connections. Okay, next, notafot more over, that last part of the pasuk, ze bechinat Mordechai. This is actually a reference to Mordechai. Mar Dror. There's a Gemara in Chulin that says that Mordechai, what does that mean? The Gemara's view is that it's not a Persian name, but it relates to the man of freedom, Mar Dror, Lasot Cherut, to create freedom. Bechinat Cherut shel Pesach. Okay, so this is another kind of deep wordplay that Pesach and Purim are deeply connected. Okay, onward. Ve'alken seruf shel Purim merumaz bePesach. Now he's going to go even deeper to a remez, to a hint, kind of an even more esoteric hint, you could say. B'pasuk shiv'at yamim tochal matzot kasher tziviticha lamoed chodesh ha'aviv. Okay, so this is a 7-day holiday that, as you've been commanded, that you should perform it in the month of the spring. Kivo yatzata Mitzrayim, because that's when you left Mitzrayim. Velo yaru panai rekam. Don't come and see me empty-handed, meaning that there's going to be sacrifices as part of that. Okay. So then that's the end of the kind of end quote from Shemot. Now here's Rabbi Nachman. Mitzrayim velo yaru panai rekam. The last words, Mitzrayim velo yaru panai rekam. Rashi Tavot Purim. If you look closely, there's a mem and there's a vav and there's a yud and a pei and a resh. If you scramble up the first letters, you actually get the word Purim. Ki Purim hu derech lePesach. The message is that Purim is a path to Pesach. Sheyu yecholim liot nisharim mechametz, so that they'll be able to be careful with respect to chametz. And before he goes any deeper, so this is in this parenthetical, this is the writing of Reb Nassan. Reb Nassan was the #1 student of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. And he wrote down the actual kind of sayings, and he puts in little notes every so often. And Rabbi Nassan adds at this point, Ufasak be'emsa ha'inyan velo gila yoter. He says, at that point, Rabbi Nachman stopped right in the middle, and he didn't reveal anything further. Okay, so there's something about what he was going in a certain direction. He said, no, I can't say anymore. Okay, but then he resumes and says, Ki batchila hayu kol ha'hatchalot mi Pesach. Because of the beginning, ki batchila, in the beginning, all the beginnings were from Pesach. Ve'al ken kol hamitzvot hem zecher l'tziat Mitzrayim. And because it used to be that all beginnings come from Pesach, we say in Kiddush, Zecher L'Tziat Mitzrayim. Ve'achshav, but now, and then again, this is Rabbi Nassan adding Velo Siyem. He didn't complete it. Very mysterious. Okay. So now let's try to break this down. Okay. I think this is an amazing text. First of all, we see Rabbi Nachman of Breslov here and like all of his brilliance. Okay, he's got this ability to lead you down the path of what's effectively a meditation. It's not quite an analysis. It's definitely not an analysis, but we kind of follow a series of word plays, and he's got this amazing mastery and breadth of use of text that allows him to weave together ideas in this way. And he's got this style that encourages the listener, the reader, to connect to the words themselves and to search for a deeper meaning. And Rabbi Nachman, he's only going to do part of the work, but he's not going to do all of it. He can kind of lead you towards an insight, but he's not leading you all the way. So we're going to have to tease it out. What is Rabbi Nachman getting at? And what is so deep that he doesn't want to go all the way and spell it out explicitly. What does Rabbi Nachman mean when he says that Purim is an approach and a path to Pesach? And what's the meaning of the connection that he's trying to make between Purim and freedom, or Purim and purity? What are the connections there? So, with an esoteric text like this, there are multiple ways to read it. And Rabbi Nachman does not spell it out for us. Okay, there's no answer key. But I think there are some places where you can kind of figure out what Rabbi Nachman is getting at. Okay, so here's one way of reading this text. Step one is to recognize Pesach is the quintessential holiday of freedom. And Pesach is a holiday that requires that we get rid of spiritual impurities in preparation. Those were kind of like some of the early paragraphs, right? Pesach is about freedom. Pesach is about getting rid of impurity. That's why we have para, and it's about getting rid of chametz, which typically represents kind of bad character traits, perhaps. Okay, that's step one. Step two is that Rabbi Nachman guides us to see that Purim shares in those themes as well. He says Purim is also a holiday of freedom, and Purim also frees us from spiritual impurities. We're gonna have to get at that. Okay, so step three. Once Rabbi Nachman has lined up these two holidays, he considers making a much deeper comparison between the two holidays, but he pulls back, and he's concerned about saying something too explicitly. What he's hinting at, but not quite saying, maybe is that not only does Purim share in these common themes with Pesach, but in some sense, Purim actually eclipses Pesach with respect to these themes. So what does that mean? So to understand what Rabbi Nachman's getting at, you have to keep in mind the things that we learned from the first source that we went through. Okay, that Purim is in some sense a holiday of even greater freedom than Pesach, as we saw. Of the Purim generation reached a level of freedom that went beyond what the generation of Pesach, the generation of Har Sinai, achieved. Okay, that in a certain spiritual sense, the earlier generation of Yetziat Mitzrayim that made it to Matan Torah didn't experience a full freedom, a full spiritual freedom in a certain sense. Okay, you might say that the generation of Yetziat Mitzrayim experienced certainly physical freedom, but maybe did not fully experience spiritual freedom to the extent that the mountain was held over their heads. Because true freedom is not just physical. True freedom is spiritual as well, you could say, right? Or the ability to make certain choices as well. And an important clue for seeing, just to kind of ground this in the text that Reb Nachman's getting at this, is from that last line where he says, Ki batchila hayu kol hatchalot mi Pesach, that originally all beginnings came from Pesach. Ve'al ken kol mitzvot hem zecher l'Yetziat Mitzrayim, right? And that's why ve'al ken. All we say when we do our practices today, we say we're doing them as a remembrance of the Exodus from Egypt. And then it says ve'achshav, something different. Okay, ki batchila ve'achshav. I don't know if this reminds anyone of anything. Okay, ki batchila, we used to be something. Ve'achshav, we're something else. I think this is a reference to a line from the Haggadah. We say, Mitchila ovdei avodah zarah hayu avoteinu. Originally, our forefathers were idolaters. Ve'achshav kervanu hamakom la'avodato. And now Hashem has brought us to his service. Okay, that line from the Haggadah expresses a similar point, that the Exodus was about more than just physical freedom. Okay, it was about spiritual freedom as well. And the background for that line of the Haggadah is a famous debate between Rav and Shmuel that's cited in the Gemara in Psachim about what the structure of Magid should be. Okay, and Rav's opinion is that we should start with Avadim Hayinu, that we were slaves, and that is the first line we follow. Right, that is the first line that we say after Manishtana. We say Avadim Hayinu lefaro Mitzrayim v'yotzeinu Hashem Elokeinu misham. The Yad Chazaka Uvizorah Netuyah. For Rav, the core of the story of Magid is about freedom from bondage. Shmuel sees it differently. Okay, he says that we ought to start from the line Mitchila Hayu Avoteinu, the line that I had just read, right? Originally, our forefathers were idolaters. For him, the core of the story is about a path to spiritual freedom, not just physical freedom. Okay, so Rabbi Nachman may be implying that even Pesach is something that we have to rise above, that we have to find an even deeper kind of freedom. And if this reading of what makes Purim special is correct, okay, then maybe the key point is that Purim is the holiday that celebrates our ability to choose spiritually in a freer way than even Pesach, right? Maybe that's what he means when he says that Purim is a path to Pesach, right? The path to true freedom, because he's told you that Pesach is about freedom, it's about purity, but the path to true spiritual freedom flows from the ability to choose. And that's something that we achieved in Purim. Okay, so when Rabbi Nachman uses the same language, mitchila ve'achshav, he's alluding to something deep, maybe something that's hard to say out loud. And maybe he's concerned to say it out loud, but let's just think through what that might be, okay? So mitchila, we used to be something. Ve'achshav, we are something else. Times change. And the sense of commandedness that used to bind our ancestors doesn't seem to bind us today. You could say that we have choices today that they never did. We have a type of freedom today that generations of Jewish people never had. And perhaps what Rabbi Nachman doesn't want to say explicitly is that true spiritual freedom involves graduating from a mindset of the generation of the Exodus to a mindset of the generation of Purim. That is, the generation of the Exodus, of Yetziat Mitzrayim, that arrived at Har Sinai. We might say, or maybe what he's getting is that certain prior generations, quote unquote, had the mountain held over their heads. Okay, like the generation of Yetziat Mitzrayim, they were free of physical bondage, but you could say they remained somewhat servile on a spiritual level because they had no choice in the matter. That today no longer works. Okay, maybe that's what it means. Ki v'tchila hayu kol hachalot mi Pesach. It used to be that the basis of everything was a Pesach style of things. Okay, ve'achshav ... Maybe that's just not the case anymore. It seems that so if that reading is a fair reading, it seems that both this source and the Gemara that we learned before are getting at kind of a similar idea. They're saying it in different ways, but what they're saying in both cases is that we are living in a different world today than our ancestors lived in. In one way, in particular, today we can choose whether to be Jewish or not. And that was not a choice that was available to Jews throughout the generations. Okay, we're truly free to accept the Torah or to ignore it. And that, it turns out, is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, the risks are greater today in some ways than ever. It turns out that apathy is actually more dangerous for Judaism than persecutions ever were. Okay, so it would seem, I mean, who knows, but it would seem that if Judaism were to disappear, it may go out with a whimper instead of a bang, okay? Especially in the diaspora, where no one's forcing Jews to give up their Judaism, but they just are. Many of them are, by choice, okay? Because they have that choice. On the other hand, the opportunity today is enormous, because any Jew today that accepts the Torah voluntarily and engages in a Jewish life today does so with a sense of devotion that in some sense goes beyond the devotion of any Jew that's ever lived. Of course, it's hard to compare it. It's not a better or worse thing, but it's different. The point is it's different because no one is forcing you to be Jewish today. There's no mountain hanging over your head. So let's recap what we saw. We'll kind of end with that. Okay, so we usually think of Purim as a holiday of salvation, of being saved from a near-death experience. And we celebrate because we're thankful that we made it out alive. But those two sources that we looked at tonight both seem to point out that Purim is not just salvation. Purim is also a holiday of freedom. And in that sense, it's similar to Pesach, which is the quintessential holiday of freedom. But we saw two sources tonight that make an even stronger statement, each in their own way. They seem to point out that Purim is not just a holiday of having been saved from danger. It's not just a holiday of having been freed from the persecutions of evil empires, okay? Rather, it's a holiday that celebrates true freedom. The ability to, Purim celebrates the ability to choose with regard to the most important aspects of your life. We might say that Purim is a holiday that celebrates, you could say, human agency with respect to Judaism, right? Meaning, human agency means we play a part in our own salvation in partnership with Hashem working behind the scenes. That's the Purim story. Human agency means that the rabbis have the ability to create a new holiday, a holiday not found in the Torah. This had never been done before. The rabbis just decided to do it. And when they made the holiday of Purim, they chose mitzvot that are expressive of human agency. Okay, so these mitzvot involve people helping other people, sharing food with them. That's what mishloach manot is. Giving charity to the poor, matanot le'avyonim. The holiday, the mitzvot of the holiday that we created, right, that people created, are different than mitzvot of Pesach, right? The key mitzvah of Pesach is a korban, of giving something, right, person to Hashem. The key mitzvah of Purim, the holiday of human agency, is mishloach manot and matanot le'avyonim. Okay, so human agency means, most of all, choosing to accept the Torah, even when the mountain is not held over your head, as we've seen. Choosing to be Jewish, even when nothing really forces you to do so other than your internal motivation. Okay, so it's true that living your life with a sense of agency and taking more responsibility for yourself is hard. It's super hard. And there are risks involved. And there's no guarantee that we'll be up to the challenge. But it's also a source of massive opportunities. So as Rabbi Nachman puts it, Purim is a path to Pesach. Maybe it's a path to an even deeper experience of Pesach, right? To an even more complete Pesach, to an even deeper kind of freedom that few generations of Jews have ever experienced. And hopefully that gives us, something to think about as we enter this joyous month of Adar, the most joyous month of the year, right? A month in which we embrace our own sense that we have the ability to make a difference in our own lives and in the lives of others. Okay, with that, Chodesh Tov, everyone.